With this episode, I want to add to my series about cognitive biases. For those of you who might be new to my podcast, I run this series of episodes where in each individual episode, I pick one specific cognitive bias and or a logical fallacy and I try to explain it in a very easy to understand manner using examples from books I've read, podcasts I've listened, and also via our everyday life. And the main idea behind it is that so we can become more aware of it, more aware of our own biases, our own delusions, and talking in terms of the language of this podcast so that we can unlearn our attachments to them. If this interests you, my website www.chetannarang.org has a section specifically dedicated to this. I'll add the link in the show notes below. And now, let's get into today's episode. Hello, good people of the internet. Welcome to the Unlearning Playground, an everyday life podcast by Chetan Narang. So the cognitive bias I've chosen for today's episode is called the framing effect. I think personally that this is one of the easiest to understand cognitive biases, and the reason for that would become very clear to you within the next minute or so. So what do we mean by the framing effect? In essence, what it means is that how something is framed, how a narrative is built for a particular thing, ends up being more important than what the underlying thing really is. So if let's say you are in the market gauging for different college courses and you receive brochures for two of them, course A is advertised in terms of there's a 75% chance that at the end of this course you will not have a job, and course B is advertised as there is 25% chance that at the end of this course you will land a job. Of course, every one of us would want to favor course B because that is a positive outcome. It is framed in terms of a positive outcome. And that is how our psychology works. We are all loss averse. We want to avoid losses and we want more gains for ourselves. Even though both of these courses are exactly the same. I mean, a 75% chance of losing is the same as a 25% chance of winning. But to play with your psychology, everyone would want to frame it in terms of the win rather than the loss. This is the framing effect. Another example that comes to my mind right now is from a book I'd read a long time back. I don't remember if it's valid these days also, but anyhow, the example that the author had given was that when credit cards were new in the system, I think it was from that time, petrol pumps or gas stations wanted to levy an extra surcharge on payments made via credit cards. There was a whole case going on in the courts, and when the credit card companies ended up losing it, the compromise that was reached was that you do not call it a credit surcharge, rather say that you are giving a discount on cash payments. And the psychology behind that was also very similar to this, just the framing effect. If you are someone who's making a payment via credit card and you are told that there's an extra surcharge if you make this payment versus you can pay by cash, you might actually be swayed and pay by cash. But if you're told that there's a discount on a cash payment and the credit card payment is just the normal payment, you might let go of the discount, right? So it's basically just that. It's basically just how it was framed. There is absolutely no difference in the amount of money that you'll pay either way, but it's more profitable for the credit card companies to call it a cash discount rather than calling it a credit surcharge. Now, this is where I want to point something out. One of the nuances that get missed out when we are studying the framing effect or when we are even talking about it is that we tend to see it as if it's something external. We tend to always see as if it's always other people who are framing things in a manner that kind of attacks our psychology or in any way misuses our psychology to their own profits and maybe also to our own loss. Like the example I just gave you about the credit card companies. So it's true, people do that. But what gets missed out is that we do the same too. I mean, we keep framing things in our minds in a manner that suits the narratives that are already preconceived within our minds, right? How something resonates with us is also a lot of times dependent on how coherent the stories it triggers within our minds are. And it's not really necessary for those stories to be based on the truth. That is a fact that happens with all of us. So the framing effect also works within our own minds. Now, for the remainder of this episode, I want to talk about two such frames that are floating around in our collective consciousness, let's say, these days, and they're a big part of our public discourse at the moment. And I want to talk about those frames from the perspective of the framing effect and how looking at things from a particular lens, from a particular frame itself, is what is actually limiting us from seeing the truth or the nuance of the entire thing. Now, both of these topics are controversial. I mean, they're as controversial as you want them to be, really, but they can be triggering for a lot of people. So, I would definitely advise you to just sit with utter honesty and utter sincerity and try to actually listen to what I'm trying to say. Let's see how it lands. So, the first frame that I want to talk about is regarding the topic of abortions. This is a hot topic in the public discourse these days. So, let's see what we can say about that. Now, whenever abortions are being discussed, there are two major frames that come out. Either you are labeled a pro-life person, in which case you say that the fetus has a life of its own and we as a society have a moral responsibility to preserve its life, so you are anti-abortion. Or either you are pro-choice, in which case you say that the woman and of course even the family in question should have the choice of whether they want to go ahead with the pregnancy and keep the baby or not, and therefore you are pro-abortion and you are pro-choice. I would firstly want to say that if your answer to the question of whether abortion should be legal or not is purely based on these frames, that you are pro-choice or you're pro-life, you are falling prey to the framing effect right away. I mean, abortion is a much more nuanced topic, and it's simply not possible to encompass everything that you should be encompassing within these narrow frames of being pro-life or pro-choice. And there are also other frames in question when it comes to abortions. I mean, people who are pro-choice seldom do understand that the people who are talking in terms of abortions being illegal, they're not really just misogynists who want to take away all power away from women. That is a very commonly heard frame on this side of the aisle, that everyone who wants to make abortions illegal is actually just doing that to exercise their power over women and take away all the choices that women have in the modern society. Of course, that's also a very simple and a very, I want to say, limited frame to approach something with, because majority of the people who are actually anti-abortion are pro-life. And you can very well see that if you really understand how an abortion works, it is a touchy subject, but it literally means killing the baby, right? It literally means killing the fetus, let's say. So it's not really that people want to take away all of the choices that the modern society levies on women. Of course not. That might be a few percentage of those people, but a majority of them are actually swayed away because abortions are framed as if they are anti-life. They are framed that if you are for abortions, you are anti-life and you're supposed to be pro-life. I mean, which person in their right state of mind would not be pro-life? Who would not want to save a baby from dying, right? So the first frame that you have to really let go of is that people who are anti-abortion are not really misogynists who want to take away choices of women. Of course not. There are other reasoning behind being anti-abortion too. And on the other side, people who are pro-life, people who claim that abortion should be banned because it means killing a baby, and we as a society need to protect the interests of the unborn, it's very commonly heard from their perspective that people who are pro-choice, people who are for abortion, actually are, baby killers. They have no sense of remorse at the fact that they're actually murdering an unborn baby and all of that jazz. And again, that is the same framing effect in practice on the other side of the aisle. I mean, there might be a few sociopaths on this side who might actually be enjoying something like that. But you're supposed to be more rational about it. I mean, it's not the majority of the people who are pro-choice and they want to have abortions as a legal practice. Because no matter which side of the aisle you stand on, you have to agree that there are some situations where an abortion is a viable choice. For example, in case of a rape. Now, if this is going to be touchy again, but I'm going to keep going. Let's say a woman was raped and now she is pregnant. Would you really be so pro-life that you want her to carry on with the pregnancy and give birth to a baby? And then do what? I mean, leave the baby into a foster home, give it up for adoption or whatnot. And that is really a question after birth. You really want her to go through those 9 months of pregnancy? That is a nuance that you really need to consider. I mean, that is a choice that women should have. And if you can't see that, it's very clear that you aren't thinking clearly. And there can be other situations too. I mean, people who cannot financially afford a baby should have an option to abort one. It's not going to be a choice that anyone's happy with. I mean, even when someone is given a capital punishment, my stand is always that it's not a choice that we should be happy with. But as a society, we have to make these choices at times, right? Very similarly, this is a situation where a choice has to be made, which I don't think the actors in the situation are very proud of, but they have to make that choice. And if you want to insist that you are pro-life, so these choices should not exist for people, you are limiting yourself. You are not really seeing the nuance of the situation. And well, to be really honest, I think in this particular situation, if you really want to be pro-life, you have to be pro-choice, because these are also lives that you're affecting if you are being completely anti-abortion. And on the other side of the aisle, there are nuances that even pro-choice people need to consider, because I don't know the exact year, but I think before 1970s or 1960s, prenatal sex determination was legal in India. It's still legal in a lot of countries, Western countries. I know it's legal in the US, but it's illegal in India because female feticide was common back in the day. People would get the sex determined for their baby, and if it turned out that the baby was going to be a girl, they would get it aborted. So the solution to that problem cannot have been that you ban abortions. I think banning prenatal sex determination is a positive step in that light. And now people who are pro-choice, can you really say that it's that family's choice, it's that woman's choice? If they or even she does not want a girl child, they should have the option to get it aborted. Of course not, right? In this particular situation, if you're actually thinking right, you want to be pro-life. You don't want to be pro-choice in this case. So I think my entire point is that you have to see the nuances of the entire situation before really falling prey to those simplistic frames that we have in our minds. A topic like abortion has more nuances to it, and you simply cannot take a stand of being pro-life, therefore I'm anti-abortion, or pro-choice, therefore I'm pro-abortion. There are nuances to be considered, and as a society, we need to consider them. Now, the second frame I want to talk about is one of the wage gap. This is also a controversial topic, but I want to give it a try anyway, because I know that in my previous example, I would have come out as more liberal than what the conservatives would have wanted me to. So now let's give something for the conservatives, right? Now, when it comes to the wage gap, there is a generalized frame that is acting underneath how we see things. If you are someone who views things from the perspective of how women have been discriminated against throughout the known human history, if that is a very prominent frame in your mind, when you're given the statement that women are paid less than men on an average, I don't think you would have any problem agreeing with it. That because women have been traditionally discriminated against, it would also be true that they're paid less than men on average, right? And this is where I would want you to consider certain nuances. I mean, you cannot just blindly agree to a statement, right? That should be obvious to you. So see, I work a day job in the software engineering industry. And if someone was to come over to me and say that within your industry, within the software engineering industry, women are paid less than men on an average, I would want to consider at least asking a few questions from the one who's reporting this stat. A few questions that come to my mind is, have you averaged it over everyone really? I mean, if I was to pick, let's say, obviously exaggerating, but this is just an example that I want to give. If I was to say that, find me the average salary of all right-handed people and the average salary of all left-handed people, would you really expect them to be equal? I mean, of course not, right? The moment you pick any single line and you put people on both sides of the line, an equality of outcome, even though that might look like a utopian expectation, it's very hard to really get that, right? And if you actually see that right-handed people are paid more than left-handed people on an average, would you want to conclude that a society or that company in question is discriminating against left-handed people? No, right? So I would want to question whether the data is for all men and women on average, or are you really considering people who are doing the same jobs? They have the same titles at least, right? Now, even people having the same titles, there are a lot of other nuances, right? For all of us who are working jobs, we know that companies have different business units, and different business units contribute to different profits, and therefore they pay their employees also differently, right? And very similarly, even within a business unit, there can be different teams contributing differently to revenue building functions, and therefore they get paid differently. Now, these differences, if you want to look at only gender as a variable and you want to find out what is the difference between salaries of men and women, you would have to remove all of those other variables. And that is going to be very hard to do. I mean, even if you were to boil it down to a single team, even within that team, can you really say that these two people are doing the same work and therefore they should get paid equal? I mean, there would be instances of this person started their job at a higher salary. They were from a college, as a result of which they were paid higher when they started, and therefore they are still on a higher package than this other person. And that first person, I have known from my life that can be a woman or can be a man, right? So the blanket statement that on an average women are paid less than men cannot really be agreed to right away. You should be considering these nuances that I just talked about. And for most companies, really, there is not a single salary figure that they have in their minds. There is a band of salary that people consider, because you cannot really normalize or equalize salary for any position. So there are bands of salaries, and within that band, most people who are doing quote unquote the same job get paid within the same band. So why I'm saying all of that? It's primarily because if you are someone who champions the cause for women, who wants to be a champion for women rights, and want to really, promote and help women excel in their lives, it's very easy to get swayed away, because the frame in your mind could be that because women have been traditionally discriminated against, this would also be true, that women are paid less than men, and there is a systemic discrimination in place which we really need to fight. If it's happening with you, you are falling prey to the framing effect. And on the other side of the aisle, if you are someone who directly dismisses this notion that there could be a systemic discrimination, you are also falling prey to your own framing effect. I mean, you cannot really just dismiss the idea that there could be something in play. There could have been, I'm not saying systemic in the sense of the entire society is discriminating against women and therefore women are paid less than men, but it could happen that there is a particular person or a particular company in question which is actually doing that. And if you close your eyes and if you just say that, no, this never happens, you are again falling prey to a simplistic frame. Don't do that. You can be better. So why I picked this example, like I said previously, in the previous example, I could have come out a lot more liberal than what conservatives would like. And so in this example, I'm pretty sure the liberals who agreed with me on the previous one would want to disagree, or at least would be triggered by what I'm saying here. So these are the nuances that I really wanted to bring forth when talking about the framing effect. If you want to identify with a simplistic frame of being called a liberal, and therefore you ignore everywhere a liberal could be wrong, you are falling prey to the framing effect. And very similarly, if you want to be labeled a conservative, and therefore you cannot see where conservatives themselves are wrong, you are again falling prey to the framing effect. No one else is responsible for the frames that you have put forward in your minds. I mean, of course, our frames are not really completely our own doings. We pick them up from our culture, from our education, from our teachers, from the podcasts we listen, etc., etc. But your frames are your responsibility. You might not be to blame for all the frames that are there in your mind, but you are responsible for them. Take care that you unlearn the frames that are not serving you, or at least unlearn the frames that are not based on the truth. And if you do not find value in that, I think that's a cause for concern anyway. Well, I guess with that, I also come to the end of this episode. You see, the fact of the matter that I wanted to bring out in this episode was that we all have frames in our minds. Some of them triggered externally, some of them very much internal to our own thinking. Some of them almost biological, like the frames that propel attraction towards wanting to avoid losses and wanting to have gains, etc. And some of the frames are more social and more cultural in nature, and we mostly pick them up from our surroundings, and that too almost unconsciously. The ones that I spoke about, the comparison between men and women, the simplistic argument for abortions as pro-life or pro-choice, such frames are floating around in our collective consciousness these days. And it behooves us to be more aware of them before actually taking actions out of them. As that man Henry David Thoreau once said, every generation laughs at the old fashions and follows its own religiously. It is time for us to wake up to our own biases, our own delusions, and then help others do the same. Now, if that isn't something worth thinking about, I don't know what is. I hope to see you in the next episode too. Until next time, peace out.